She married a quiet human and uncovered a power that shook her empire. HFY Princess Celera of the Arathian Empire had always been surrounded by power. Raised to rule, she had never known a life outside the high towers of the palace or the grand halls of her father's court. Her days were filled with lessons in diplomacy, combat, and the fine arts of leadership. From a young age, she was taught that the fate of her people rested on her shoulders. She was expected to marry strategically, and when the time came, she was promised to a man who would solidify the empire's alliances with neighboring systems. It was a matter of duty, not love. Yet even though she had been betrothed to General Verk, a formidable Arathian warrior who was known across the galaxy for his skill in battle, something unsettled Celera. Her impending marriage was a calculated move in a game of politics and conquest, and she had accepted it as her fate. But deep inside, she wondered if there could be more to life than alliances, power, and endless war. She dreamed of a world where the weight of her crown didn't press so heavily on her heart. Then came the humans. They were a new addition to the galactic scene, recently discovered and barely integrated into the Empire's networks. At first, they were nothing more than curiosities to her, strange, insignificant beings from a faraway planet. But when her father, Emperor Dernak, arranged a diplomatic mission to Earth, she had no choice but to accompany him. It was during this mission that she first met him. Eric, the human diplomat assigned to represent his people, was nothing like she expected. He was quiet, too quiet, in fact. At first glance, he seemed like a simple man, almost an afterthought among the other humans who were part of the delegation. He lacked the arrogance and bravado of the Arathian warriors she was used to. His presence was subtle, his speech measured, as though he carefully considered every word before speaking. His clothing, a simple suit with no ornamentation, made him appear even more out of place among the opulent uniforms of her people. Yet, there was something about him that piqued her curiosity. While her father and his advisors discussed politics and trade agreements with the human leaders, Celera found herself observing Eric from across the room. There was a calmness to him, a stillness that seemed to contrast with the bustling energy of the palace. When he looked at her, his dark eyes were warm, but not in a way that made her uncomfortable. It was as if he saw her, not as a princess, not as an heir to the empire, but simply as a person. That was strange to her. People always saw her as the future ruler, the princess, the powerful figure who could bend the galaxy to her will. Yet, Eric saw through all of that. As the days went on, Celera's curiosity about him grew. She found herself looking for excuses to engage with him, something that never happened with anyone else. She had to admit, she found his presence oddly comforting. It was as if the noise of the universe faded when he was near. One evening, as they were both walking through the palace gardens after a formal dinner, Celera spoke to him. It was a simple conversation, nothing too important. She asked him about his life on Earth, about the history of his people, and what they hoped to achieve by joining the galactic community. His answers were calm, collected, and thoughtful, but more than that, they were different from what she expected. "I believe our people want peace," Eric said quietly, his gaze focused on the distant stars. "We've fought wars for centuries on our homeworld. We don't want to repeat that in space. We want to learn, to grow, and to find a place among the stars without repeating the mistakes of the past." Celera was surprised by the sincerity in his voice. There was no grand vision of conquest, no desire for power, just peace. She had never heard a human speak with such clarity before. Most of the other delegates were focused on trade deals, on strengthening the alliances between the planets. But Eric, he spoke as if peace was something worth fighting for, something worth striving for above all else. As they continued to talk, Celera found herself wondering if Eric truly understood the weight of his words. The Arathian Empire, for all its grandeur and might, was built on power. Her father, the Emperor, ruled with an iron fist, expanding the empire through force and diplomacy alike. But here was this quiet human, talking about peace in a galaxy where war was the only language that mattered. The more she spoke to Eric, the more she realized how different he was from the warriors and politicians she had grown up with. He didn't seek power, he didn't crave attention, and he wasn't trying to prove himself to anyone. He was content in his own skin, in his own quiet way. There was something refreshing about that, but it was more than just his quiet demeanor that caught her attention. It was the way people reacted to him. The Arathians around him were often respectful, but there was a fear in their eyes. The way they looked at Eric was not like the way they looked at her or her father. It was as if they were afraid of him. And that in turn made Celara curious. Why were they afraid of him? Her curiosity grew over the following weeks. She started to notice things she hadn't before. People would subtly step back when Eric entered a room, or their conversations would pause when he walked by. There was an energy around him, a kind of unease. It wasn't until one night, after a particularly tense dinner where Eric had remained quiet the entire evening, that Celara began to piece things together. She found herself alone in her chambers, staring out at the stars, her mind racing. It was during moments like these, when the weight of her royal duties seemed too heavy to bear, that she wished she could escape. And yet there was something in the quietness of Eric that calmed her. Something in him that made her feel as though, just maybe, there was a chance for something different. As she turned away from the window, she heard a soft knock on the door. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened it, there stood Eric, his hands clasped in front of him as though he were waiting for permission to speak. "Princess," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I wanted to speak with you about something personal." Celara stepped aside, allowing him to enter. She motioned for him to sit, though she herself remained standing. There was an intensity in his eyes, something more than the calm exterior he showed everyone else. She waited for him to speak. I don't mean to be rude," Eric began, his voice barely above a whisper, "but there's something about this place, about the Arathians, that doesn't sit right with me. I've been to many planets, spoken with many leaders, but there's something here that feels off." Celara was taken aback. "What do you mean?" Eric hesitated for a moment, as though weighing his words carefully. "There's a power here, a force that hangs over everything. It's in the air, in the way people move, in the way they look at you. And it's not just because of your title, it's something else." Celara's heart skipped a beat. Could he possibly know? Could he be talking about the strange sensations she'd felt herself? The power that seemed to stir inside her when she was near certain people, certain places. Before she could respond, Eric stood up. "I don't want to cause trouble, Princess. I just thought you should know. You're not the only one who feels it." And with that, he left, leaving Celara alone with her thoughts. As she sat back down, her mind raced. There was something more to this quiet man than anyone realized. Something that even her father, the mighty emperor, had missed. But what was it? What was the power that lay hidden within this human, this quiet human, whose presence was both unsettling and oddly comforting? As Celara gazed out at the stars once more, she realized that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't even imagine. And it was all because of Eric, the quiet human who had already begun to unravel the mysteries of her empire. Princess Celara couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. After the conversation with Eric, the human diplomat, she found herself thinking about him more than she cared to admit. His quiet nature, the way he saw through her outer shell and saw her simply as a person, no titles, no expectations, was like nothing she had ever experienced before. But there was more to it than just his calm demeanor. There was something beneath the surface, something that made the air around him feel different. Days passed, and Celara found herself watching him from a distance, her curiosity growing with each passing moment. She noticed that people around him were often uncomfortable. Arathians, who were usually confident and proud in the presence of others, seemed to become uneasy when they spoke to him. They would shift their weight nervously, glance around the room, or even avoid his gaze altogether. It wasn't the kind of discomfort she was used to seeing. It wasn't the kind of discomfort that came from a political rival or an enemy. It was something deeper, something more primal. The more she observed, the more confused she became. What was it about Eric that unsettled her people so much? The Arathians weren't known for being afraid of anything. They were warriors, diplomats, and conquerors who had built an empire that spanned across many star systems. But when Eric entered the room, it was as if the air itself changed. Celara decided to investigate. She knew she had to get closer to him to understand what was going on. Her position as a princess meant she had access to almost everything, and soon she found herself sneaking into the restricted areas of the palace where she wasn't supposed to go. She wasn't looking for trouble, but she was looking for answers, and she was determined to find them. One evening, after the palace had fallen quiet, Celara made her way down a narrow hallway that led to the ancient archives. She had heard rumors that the palace was built on top of older structures, older knowledge that had been hidden away for centuries. The Arathians were careful with their history, often burying things they didn't want anyone to find. But Solara knew that somewhere within the labyrinth of the palace, there were records that could explain what was happening. As she entered the archive chamber, the soft glow of the lights flickered. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of old paper and forgotten secrets filled her nostrils. She moved quietly, running her fingers along the rows of ancient scrolls and data pads. The information here wasn't meant for her eyes, but she couldn't help herself. She had to know more. It wasn't long before she stumbled upon something strange. A thick, worn scroll unlike any other she had seen before. It was ancient, even by Arathian standards. Its surface was inscribed with symbols that seemed almost alive. The writing was in an old dialect that Solara didn't recognize, but she had been trained in many languages. She slowly began to translate the markings. It spoke of a time long before the Arathian Empire had come into power, a time when humanity was believed to be a myth. According to the scroll, the humans weren't just a newly discovered species. They were an ancient race, one that had once been feared by the Arathians. Their power, the scroll explained, was unlike anything the Arathians had ever known. It described humans as being able to manipulate energy to bend the fabric of space itself. The scroll called it the touch of the mind. Solara's heart raced as she read. This was impossible, wasn't it? Humans were no more than simple beings from a backwater planet. They had no significant history, no power worth fearing. But according to the scroll, the Arathians had once waged a war against them, wiping out any trace of their existence. The power they had once held, however, had not been destroyed. It had been hidden away, buried deep beneath the surface of their civilization. The realization hit Solara like a wave. Could Eric be one of them? Could he be a descendant of these ancient humans with the power to manipulate the fabric of reality? She had to find out. The question gnawed at her, growing stronger with each passing moment. She had to know if Eric was truly what the scroll suggested. The next day, she couldn't stop thinking about it. She looked at him differently now. His quiet nature, his calm presence, it all made sense. He wasn't just a diplomat, he was something more, something dangerous. Solara decided to confront him. She couldn't hold back her questions any longer. She had to know the truth. That evening, she found him alone in the palace garden. The air was cooler than usual, and the stars above were bright and clear. Eric was sitting on a stone bench, his hands resting in his lap, staring out at the horizon. As always, there was an air of quietness around him, as though he were lost in thought or perhaps somewhere far away. "Eric," she called softly, stepping into the garden. He turned his head, his dark eyes meeting hers. There was no surprise in his expression, no hesitation, just that quiet, steady gaze that made her feel both nervous and oddly at ease. "Princess Solara," he said, standing up as she approached. "What brings you here?" Solara hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "I need to ask you something. It's important." Eric nodded, his expression unreadable. "Of course, what is it?" She took a deep breath. "You're not just a human, are you?" Eric's eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing. He simply watched her, waiting. "You have power," she continued, her voice steady despite the growing unease in her chest. "You're not like the others. There's something about you, something that makes the people here afraid. What are you?" Eric's gaze softened. He looked away for a moment, as if considering whether or not to answer. Finally, he spoke. "I've known for some time that you'd figure it out," he said quietly. "I didn't want to bring it up. I didn't want anyone to know, but the truth is, I'm not like other humans. I'm different." Solara's heart pounded in her chest. "What does that mean? What kind of power do you have?" Eric took a step closer to her, his voice lowering even further. "I have the ability to influence the fabric of reality, to manipulate energy, space, and time in ways that even the Arathians can't comprehend. It's something that's been passed down through generations, though most of it was hidden, suppressed." Solara's mind raced. "Why did the Arathians hide this? Why did they erase all records of your people?" Eric sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Because they feared us. They feared what we could do. Humanity's power was too great, too dangerous for them to control, and so they wiped us out, erased us from history. They buried the truth, just as they buried the knowledge of our power." Solara stood there, stunned. Everything she thought she knew about her empire, about her people, was being turned upside down. The power of the Arathians had always been their strength, their ability to dominate others. But Eric and the humans held a power that even the greatest warriors of the Arathian Empire could never match. For the first time in her life, Solara felt a shift within her, a shift that told her her future was no longer in her control. The very man she had once seen as a mere diplomat, a quiet, unassuming human, was now the key to something much greater than she could ever have imagined. And the empire she had been raised to rule, it was built on lies. Eric's gaze softened as he saw the confusion and fear in her eyes. I never wanted to be a weapon, Princess. I never wanted to be a part of this war. I just wanted to live my life to find peace. But the truth can't be hidden forever. Solara's voice trembled. What are we supposed to do now? Eric stepped closer to her, his voice steady and firm. We have to decide if we will allow the Empire to continue on its path of destruction or if we will change it, together. In that moment, Solara knew that everything was about to change. And it was all because of the quiet human who had unlocked a power that had remained hidden for centuries. Princess Solara stood still, her mind racing as Eric's words echoed in her head. The reality of what he had just confessed was almost too much to process. The Arathian Empire, the empire she had spent her entire life preparing to lead, was built on a lie. Everything she had been taught, everything she had believed, was now called into question. And at the center of it all stood Eric, the quiet human who had come to her as nothing more than a diplomat. Eric could see the confusion in her eyes, the storm of thoughts that seemed to swirl behind them. He stepped back, giving her space to process everything. But he didn't leave. He couldn't. He had known, even before meeting Solara, that the time would come when he would have to reveal the truth that his people had kept hidden for centuries. And now that truth was out in the open, and Solara was the key to what would come next. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The stars above twinkled quietly, and the air around them felt heavy with the weight of what had just been revealed. Finally, Solara broke the silence. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eric hesitated. He had considered telling her everything from the start, but he had known how dangerous it could be. The Arathians, with their vast empire and their immense power, would never accept the truth. And he, a quiet human from a faraway world, would be crushed beneath the weight of their fear. But Solara was different. She had seen something in him that no one else had. Something that made her believe in the possibility of a different future. "I couldn't," Eric said quietly. "I had to be sure. I had to know that you could handle the truth, that you could understand what it means." Solara's brow furrowed. "What does it mean?" "What do we do with this power, Eric? What do we do with the truth that you've been hiding for so long?" Eric looked at her, his eyes soft but resolute. "We have a choice. We can either continue down the path the Empire has been on for centuries, with all the violence and destruction that comes with it, or we can change things. We can create a new future, one where power is used for peace, not for control." The idea of peace seemed almost impossible to Solara. The Arathian Empire had been built on war, conquest, and domination. For centuries, her people had expanded their reach across the galaxy, crushing anyone who stood in their way. Her father, Emperor Dernak, ruled with an iron fist, and his vision for the future was one of continued expansion. But the more Solara thought about it, the more she realized that there had to be another way. A way that didn't involve endless bloodshed. "But how?" Solara asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. "How do we change something as vast and powerful as the Arathian Empire? It's too big, too entrenched." Eric took a step closer to her, his presence calm but firm. "We start small. We begin with what we can control. We don't need to take down the entire empire at once, but we can change the way people think. We can show them that there's another way to live, a way of peace, of understanding, but we need to do it together." Solara's heart skipped a beat. She had never considered that before. She had always been taught that power came from domination, from strength. But Eric was asking her to believe in something different, to believe in the power of peace. "Together," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. Eric nodded. "Yes, together. I'm not asking you to abandon your people, Solara. I'm asking you to help me show them that there's another way, a way where power isn't used to destroy, but to build." Solara felt a lump form in her throat. The idea was both terrifying and beautiful. It would be a challenge like nothing she had ever faced before. But she knew, deep down, that Eric was right. The empire, as it was now, could not last forever. The cracks in its foundation were already beginning to show. And maybe, just maybe, they had a chance to rebuild it if they could do it the right way. "I don't know if I can do this," Solara admitted, her voice shaky. "I don't know if I'm ready for what it means." You don't have to be ready, Eric said gently. You just have to be willing to try. Solara looked up at him, and for the first time since they had met, she saw something in his eyes, something that made her believe. It wasn't just his power, it was his belief in her. In them, together they could change the future. I'll try, she said, her voice steadying. But we need to be careful. My father, he won't like this. He'll do anything to keep the empire the way it is. Eric's expression grew serious. We'll have to be careful, but we'll also have to be bold. If we're going to change things, we can't do it by hiding in the shadows. We have to act. We have to show the people of the empire that change is possible. Solara nodded. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Her father, the emperor, had always ruled with an iron fist, and he wouldn't easily be swayed. But Solara had been raised to lead, to make tough decisions. And this, she realized, was the toughest decision she would ever make. She wasn't just choosing to challenge her father's rule. She was choosing to stand with Eric, to stand with humanity, and to fight for a future that didn't rely on destruction. That night, as Solara lay in her bed, she couldn't sleep. Her mind was filled with thoughts of what lay ahead. The path before her was uncertain, and the stakes had never been higher. If they were going to succeed, they would have to be careful, patient, and above all, strong. They had to be willing to risk everything for the possibility of something better. The next day, Solara met with her closest advisors. They had to be careful who they trusted. The empire was built on a delicate web of alliances, and if word of their plans got out, everything could come crashing down. But Solara was determined. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back now. As she spoke with her advisors, she couldn't help but notice the way they looked at her. Some of them seemed nervous, others skeptical. They had always followed her lead, but now, with the possibility of a revolution on the horizon, Solara felt the weight of their expectations more than ever. They were looking to her for guidance, for direction, and for the first time she wasn't sure she had all the answers. But Eric's words echoed in her mind. We don't need to take down the entire empire at once. We can change the way people think. And so they began their work. Slowly, carefully, they started to make moves. They reached out to those within the empire who were dissatisfied with the way things were. They found allies in unexpected places, people who had been overlooked, ignored, or oppressed by the empire. Together, they began to build a coalition for change. But it wasn't enough to just talk. They had to show the people of the empire that change was possible, that the empire didn't have to be built on war and conquest. It could be rebuilt on something stronger, something better. And so they began to plan. A plan that would take time, a plan that would require everything they had. But it was a plan that could change the future, not just for the Arathians, but for all the people of the galaxy. The road ahead would not be easy. Solara knew that. There would be battles to fight, enemies to face, and sacrifices to be made. But she also knew that the future was in their hands. And together with Eric by her side, she was ready to change the galaxy for good. The weeks that followed were filled with tension and uncertainty. Solara and Eric had made their decision, but now the real work began. The path they were walking was treacherous, and the stakes were higher than either of them had imagined. The Arathian Empire, with its long history of strength and power, would not easily accept change. And Solara knew that her father, Emperor Durnak, would do whatever it took to maintain control over the galaxy. Solara spent her days carefully considering every move. She couldn't afford to make mistakes. One wrong word, one wrong action, and the empire could fall into chaos. Her closest advisors had started to question her decisions, sensing a shift in her demeanor, a growing distance between them. They didn't know the full truth, and Solara couldn't risk telling them just yet. The fewer people who knew what was truly happening, the better. Eric, too, had begun to feel the weight of their plans. His quiet, steady nature had always been a source of strength, but now he too was beginning to feel the pressure. The power he held within him, the power that the Arathians had long feared, was growing stronger by the day. He had learned to control it over the years, but he knew that it would be hard to keep it hidden forever. The last thing they needed was for his abilities to be discovered before the time was right. One evening, as Solara sat alone in her chambers, staring out at the stars, she felt a familiar presence behind her. Eric had come to speak with her again. "Princess," he said, his voice soft but carrying the weight of an unspoken question. Solara turned to face him, meeting his eyes. "What is it?" "I think it's time we take the next step," he said, his words measured and deliberate. The longer we wait, the more dangerous it becomes. We need to act before your father catches wind of what we're planning." Solara nodded, her mind already racing. She had known this day would come. The day when they would have to make their move, when the quiet rebellion they had been building would need to come into the light. But the thought of going against her father, of confronting the very empire she had been raised to protect, filled her with dread. "I know," she said softly. "But how? How do we do this without tearing everything apart?" Eric stepped closer, his gaze steady. "We don't need to tear everything apart. We just need to show the people that there's another way, a way to live without the fear of constant war, without the need for power and control." Solara thought about his words, the weight of them sinking in. She had always believed that the only way to maintain peace was through strength, but Eric had shown her a way that didn't rely on domination. Still, it seemed impossible. The Arathian Empire had been built on that very idea. "We can't do this alone," Solara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need more people, more allies." "We've already started to find them," Eric replied. "There are those within the Empire who are tired of the constant war, tired of the lies. We just need to bring them together." Solara took a deep breath. She knew that Eric was right. The Empire was full of people who had been crushed under its weight. People who were waiting for someone to show them that there was another way. She and Eric would have to lead them. "I'll start reaching out to my contacts," she said, determination beginning to fill her chest. "But it's going to take time. My father has spies everywhere. If word gets out too soon, it could destroy everything." "We'll be careful," Eric said. "We just need to take it one step at a time." But as the days passed, Solara began to feel the walls closing in around her. The pressure to keep up the appearance of loyalty to her father grew heavier. She was expected to attend every council meeting, every dinner, every public appearance, and all the while, she had to maintain the illusion that everything was normal. But it was, and the longer she played her role, the more dangerous it became. One day, during a routine meeting with her father and his council, Solara found herself struggling to hide her growing unease. Emperor Durnak had always been a powerful figure, a man whose very presence commanded respect. But now, as she sat at the council table, listening to him speak about military strategies and expanding the empire's reach, she found herself questioning everything she had been taught to believe. Her father's vision of the future was one of endless conquest. The Arathians were always seeking new systems to conquer, new species to dominate. It had worked for centuries, and Durnak had always believed that it was the only way to ensure peace. But Solara no longer saw it that way. She saw the destruction it caused, the suffering it inflicted on innocent people, and she saw how her father's ambition had blinded him to the true cost of his actions. "Princess Solara," her father said suddenly, breaking her from her thoughts. "What is your opinion on the new strategy for the Peller system?" Solara hesitated, unsure of what to say. If she spoke out now, if she questioned her father's plans in front of the council, it could be disastrous. But if she didn't speak, she felt as if she were betraying everything she believed in. She took a deep breath and met her father's gaze. "I think we should consider other options. Perhaps diplomacy would be a better choice this time, rather than force." Durnak's expression hardened. "Diplomacy?" he repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. "You've been influenced by these pacifists, Solara. You forget what makes us strong. It is power, not diplomacy, that keeps the galaxy in check." "I haven't forgotten," Solara said quietly, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "But I think we need to consider what's best for the future, not just what keeps us in control now." There was a heavy silence as her father glared at her, and for a moment, Solara feared that she had gone too far. But then Durnak leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "Your idealism will be your downfall, princess," he said coldly. "You would do well to remember your place." Solara's heart raced. She had never seen her father like this. He had always been confident, assured in his power, but now there was a hint of something else in his voice, fear. He was afraid of what she was suggesting, afraid of the changes she wanted to make. And that fear only strengthened her resolve. As the meeting ended and the council members filed out of the room, Solara remained seated, lost in thought. Her father had never been one to show weakness, but she had seen it today. He knew that the empire was changing, and he was scared. And that fear was exactly what they needed to leverage if they were going to succeed. That evening, as Solara met with Eric in the quiet of the garden, she told him what had happened in the council meeting. He knows, she said, her voice filled with determination. He knows something is happening, something he can't control, and he's afraid. Eric nodded. That's good. Fear is a powerful motivator, but we have to use it carefully. If we push too hard, too fast, it will only make him lash out. Solara thought for a moment, her eyes fixed on the stars above. I think it's time to make our move. We can't keep hiding forever. Eric's gaze softened. Are you sure you're ready for this? I have to be, she replied, her voice steady. The Empire is falling apart. It's only a matter of time before my father makes a mistake, and when he does, we'll be ready. As they stood there, side by side, Solara felt a sense of resolve settle in her chest. The road ahead would be difficult, and the challenges would be immense. But she knew, with Eric at her side, they had the power to change the galaxy. The Empire would have to evolve or crumble. And Solara would do whatever it took to ensure that peace, not power, would shape the future. The moment had come. Solara stood in the grand hall of the palace, her heart racing in her chest. The walls around her seemed to close in as she gazed at the figure sitting at the end of the long table. Emperor Durnak, her father, sat on his throne-like chair, his piercing eyes studying her. The council members, who had once been her allies, now looked at her with suspicion, wondering where her loyalties truly lay. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Solara had never imagined that her relationship with her father would come to this, a confrontation that could either change the galaxy or destroy everything she had ever known. And yet, here she was, standing before the most powerful man in the Empire, ready to reveal the truth. She took a deep breath, her voice steady as she addressed her father. Father, the Empire is at a crossroads. We cannot continue down this path of endless war and conquest. We need to change. We need a new way. Durnak's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. A new way? He repeated, his voice cold and mocking. Your idealism is naive, Solara. The Empire was built on strength, on power. It's the only thing that keeps the galaxy in order. Without it, we would be nothing. I'm not asking you to abandon strength, Father, Solara said calmly. I'm asking you to consider something more. We can still be strong, but we don't have to rule with fear and domination. We can lead with compassion, with understanding. A low murmur ran through the council members as they exchanged uncertain glances. Solara could see the disbelief in their eyes. To them, the idea of peace and diplomacy was a fantasy, a weakness. The Empire had always ruled with an iron fist, and they couldn't imagine any other way. I've been speaking with people, Solara continued, her voice gaining strength. There are many within the Empire who are tired of the endless fighting, tired of the bloodshed. They want peace, they want a chance to live without the constant fear of war. Durnak stood up, his imposing figure casting a shadow over the room. You've been listening to the wrong people, Solara, he said, his voice rising in anger. This is the reality of the galaxy. You can't change that. We are who we are because we are stronger than everyone else. And if you think you can just throw that all away for the sake of some misguided dream, then you are gravely mistaken. Solara felt her heart pounding in her chest, but she didn't back down. No, Father, she said firmly. You're mistaken. The Empire has been built on fear, but that doesn't mean it has to stay that way. We can build something better, something that lasts, but we can't do it if we continue to hold on to the past. Durnak's gaze turned cold, his lips curling into a sneer. So you've been talking to the humans, haven't you? He spat. You've let their weakness infect your mind. You think they know better than us. They've always been nothing more than a primitive species, incapable of understanding true power. And now you've let them sway you. Solara's chest tightened, but she didn't flinch. She had known this moment would come, the moment when her father would accuse her of betrayal. But the truth was, it wasn't the humans who had shown her a new path. It was Eric. And it was the realization that the Arathian way, the way of endless expansion and dominance, had caused too much suffering, too much pain. It was a way that could never bring lasting peace. I've seen the truth, Father, she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. The Arathian Empire is built on a lie. We've taken from others, crushed those who stood in our way, and called it strength. But that's not strength. True strength comes from unity, from working together, not from conquering others. The silence in the room was deafening. Durnak stared at her for a long moment, his eyes burning with fury. You think you can change the Empire? He growled. You think you can just undo everything we've built in a few short weeks? You are nothing but a fool, Solara, and you'll see that soon enough. At that moment, Eric stepped forward, standing by Celera's side. The council members tensed, their eyes flicking nervously to him. They had seen him around, of course, heard of his strange abilities, his quiet presence. But they hadn't fully understood what he was capable of. No one had until now. Eric's voice was calm but carried an undeniable power. "The Empire doesn't have to be this way, Emperor Durnak," he said. "The power you've built is based on fear, but fear is fragile. Peace, on the other hand, is strong. It lasts, and we can build a new future together." Durnak's eyes flared with anger. "You speak of peace, human, but you don't understand the first thing about power. This empire is mine. It will remain mine, and anyone who stands against me will pay the price." The tension in the room was unbearable. Celera felt the weight of her father's words pressing down on her. The Emperor was more than just her father. He was a symbol of the Empire itself. And if she was going to take a stand, it meant going against everything she had ever known. But she couldn't back down. Not now. "I'm not asking for war, father," Celera said, her voice firm. "But I will not stand by and let the Empire continue down this path. The people are suffering, the galaxy is suffering, and I won't be a part of it anymore." Durnak's expression hardened, his fists clenched. "Then you've made your choice," he said coldly. "But know this, Celera, you are no longer my daughter. You are an enemy of the Empire." With those words, the room seemed to shudder. Celera felt a sharp pain in her chest, but she held her ground. Her father had just disowned her. And yet, in that moment, she felt freer than she ever had before. She had chosen her path. She had chosen the future. As Durnak stormed out of the room, the council members sat in stunned silence. They had never seen the Emperor so angry. Celera knew that the moment she had feared had finally arrived. The Empire would soon be in turmoil. But she also knew that there was no turning back. They couldn't stay hidden forever. They had to act. Eric turned to her, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. Celera nodded, though her heart was still racing. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady. "It's done." With the Emperor now firmly against them, Celera and Eric knew that the real battle was just beginning. The Empire would not go down without a fight. But Celera was no longer afraid. She had found her strength, and it came not from the Empire's power, but from her own conviction. She had chosen a new path, a path that would lead to peace, to healing, and to a future where the galaxy could thrive without fear. Over the next few days, the news of Celera's defiance spread like wildfire throughout the Empire. The council members who had once supported her father began to question their loyalty. Some of them, uncertain about the Emperor's vision, started to join Celera's cause. They weren't ready to let go of the power they had enjoyed under Durnak's rule, but they were willing to entertain the idea of change. The first real breakthrough came when a group of high-ranking military officers, disillusioned by the constant wars and brutal tactics, approached Celera and Eric. They expressed their support for a peaceful resolution, but they needed a leader, someone who could inspire the people to rise up against the Emperor's tyranny. And that leader, they believed, was Celera. "I never wanted to be a leader not like this," Celera said, her voice filled with doubt. "I never asked for any of this." Eric placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze steady. "You don't have to do this alone, Celera. You've already shown them that peace is possible. Now we just have to make sure they know that it's worth fighting for." Celera nodded, her resolve hardening. The path ahead would be long, and the challenges would be many. But with Eric by her side and the support of those who believed in a better future, Celera knew that she could change the galaxy. The Arathian Empire, for all its power, would have to evolve, and together they would create a future built not on fear, but on hope.